Andrei Desnitsky, Institute for Bible Translation, Moscow. Thank you very much. It was a very interesting presentation, and I think that we all realize that actually translation is not as mechanical as car repairs or car examination, and of course it's much more difficult to judge whether a translation is trustworthy than to check the mileage, the real mileage of a used car. And what else comes to my mind is that logic of rational egoism. I think it also depends very much on the general situation in the society, especially looking from the post-Soviet experience of the wild market where everyone was interested in just grabbing as much as possible and leaving instead of building strong relationships with the customers and so on. I think it's also true, isn't it, that it depends pretty much on the level of solidarity and the level of, say, the people trust their government, that if I follow a certain routine, if I get certificates, my neighbors will do the same, and the government will not be, you know, very selective in applying its control, and these certificates will not be distributed to the best friends of the director of the certificate center, and so on. And so I wonder, did this survey reflect the difference between the, say, Swiss system and the system in the post-Soviet countries, which I would expect wouldn't meet the standards in the same way?
Yeah, that's a good question. In the international indexes of corruption, European countries are pretty low across the board. I mean, the general trust in government and in educational services is remarkably high. The real problem was not there that we perceived. The problem was in some Central European countries where everybody is on the books as a translator, particularly as an authorized translator. I cited the case of Romania, where everybody who's done modern languages, has had a pass in a modern languages degree, is on the books as an authorized translator. That's a problem. But it stands to reason. You know, the first draft of the report, I had great fun with Adriana Tassini. And my employers actually enjoyed that. But then it was pointed out to me that, you know, in the United States, people have a right to do that. People have a right to sell certification as a commodity, whichever way they want. You know, she wasn't telling any lies. She was offering a product for a price, and some people are going to buy into that. But then I did get reports of people who had got that certification and then tried to join a translators association and presented that as a degree and had it refused. So there is a corrective mechanism within the system. You know, you can try anything, but there are people in place who will not accept it, and the system will return within the limits of little white lies that don't break the system. Okay. The question, the theory is eloquent in that it looks at the long view. Rational egoists seek cooperation because it's good for everyone in the long term. People can come in and break the system and get a free ride, but only in the short term. And if there's too many of them, the whole system will fall down. Okay? That's why you go through periods of cowboy economies before other systems of trust are built up. Or so says the theory. Okay.
David Maxwell, Concordia Seminary in St. Louis. I had a question about translators in a university setting. After I got my PhD, it occurred to me that I could do research by writing monographs on patristic texts, or I could translate patristic texts. But it was made clear to me that at least in many universities in the United States, translation does not count towards tenure. And I was wondering if you had any thoughts or comments on that.
That's much discussed in many countries. in many places in Europe, a doctoral thesis can be an annotated translation, particularly of classical texts, where the annotation and the commentary, or traduction raisonnée, is substantial. In the academic system I work in Spain, we do get points for the introductions and the glossaries to a translation, but not for the translation itself. But there has been progress in that field on many fronts. Perhaps not in the United States, I feel, but perhaps other people would know more about that than me.
Mirna Radin Sabadoš, Novi Sad, Univerzitet u Novom Sadu. Does it work? Okay, thank you. I wanted to ask you, do you have about the gender equality in companies? Because the list did say that there are 74% freelance, which leaves 26% who are probably employed by the companies. Does it say whether the translators employed by the companies are either men or women, or both? And does it say how high in the company have been the men that belong to the non-translators evaluating the position of translators, and how high were the women? Because that might also indicate that the hierarchy would show the women being lower in the ranks and seeing translators as higher than themselves.
Yeah, the only actually good study of translation companies that we have, a very thorough study, is of northern Portugal. It's a doctoral thesis by Fernando Alves. And he found, as we might expect, that company directors of a company that has more than 5 people tend to be men, and that people working as IT engineers in the companies tend to be men, and that most of the translators who are single-person companies, as they say in Portugal, do tend to be women. And there is a marked sex imbalance in the industry, although more and more women are moving into the higher positions. One of the things that was found through analyzing a large, I think 1,400 people surveyed by the French Society for Translators, here my colleagues reanalyzed the data and found that in general men did get paid more than women, significantly more. But they also used more translation technologies and claimed to have higher productivity rates, higher output. Okay, so the gender imbalance was there, men towards technology, technology raises productivity, productivity leads to more money. In the salaried translators, this was in the freelance market, and overall it was still significant, but if you separate out the salaried translators, the prices and the productivity were exactly the same. Okay, so remarkably enough, the difference is annulled when people are in-house, but is operative out in the free market.
Todd Clayman, National Taiwan Normal University. Anthony, I just want to pick up on something that Andre said and something I was thinking about, this lemon analogy. Recently, I just bought a second-hand motorbike, so I'm interested in this. But I just want to look at, for example, with the car situation, the customer needs the car to do a certain thing. And if you're from a mechanic's perspective, usually if the insides are running and everything's working correctly, the car will do what the customer wants. But to use that as an analogy for the translation industry, the same deal, the customer wants the translation to do a certain thing. But based on translation theory or based on the translator's notion of the translation can be entirely dysfunctional and still meet the needs of the customer. Whereas with a car, I don't think that's true. I don't think that it could not have a motor and it could still meet the needs of the customer. And so I'm just interested in what you think about the different workings of the relationship between the customer's needs and the actual functionality or dysfunctionality of the translation itself. Thank you.
aren't you amazed at the diversity of cars and motorbikes? I mean, do we really need such, you know, from the big SUVs down to these little smart cars? Do we really need that range of capacity, colors, sizes, price? Perhaps, yeah. One of the things that's appearing, certainly in the translation market, is a diverse nature of quality. That quality is no longer one thing. Quality, as Andrew Chesterton says in a lecture, quality is a relation between available resources and expectations of function. I've done translations for the DGT where you just get one instruction. You know, this text has to be translated. Nobody's going to read it. Évitez les contresens. Don't put any contradictions in. That's my one instruction from the client. Go as fast as you possibly can. It has to be done. A lot of translations are being done like that. The stuff that's outsourced to India is at that level, where a GIST translation is good enough, or filling up the available space to comply with the law is what's happening. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. So I disagree. I think there are many kinds of cars because there are many different purposes, and we're seeing the same thing happen in the translation field. But it's just the basic Skopos lesson, you know. Find out from your client, find out what the instructions are before you get down and do the job.
I'm Hongshu Chen from Furen University in Taiwan. If I was wrong, please correct me. You mentioned that trials has been suspended because of the lack of interpreters. And that reminds me of the situation like in the hospital. Okay, so people's life cannot wait for years because they need surgery, they need doctors. But what if they, so that's why I wonder, how is the medical translation or interpretation situation? I mean, people can wait. They need surgery immediately. They cannot just, it's different from the trials. You can wait for years. That's fine, but people's lives, you cannot wait. So how is the medical situation?
Okay, there's a certain pragmatics that does come into play. European law for criminal trials says that the defendant has a right to follow proceedings in a language they can understand. They don't talk about mother tongue, a language they can understand, and they don't define what the term understand means. Okay? And most of the trials are suspended because the judge doesn't understand the interpreter, you know, which is quite different. In medical situations, and we've done research on this, and in Alcalá de Henares in Spain, they're doing a lot of research on this. You get people operating in a second or third language and communicating. You get the children coming in, which is incredibly bad in many cases for women who have women's problems, etc. And the children have to be the mediators. This is a classic situation that you want to avoid for obvious ethical reasons. But the impression I have is that with goodwill, people sort of get through, more or less. I mean, at the end of the day, a human body is a human body. Suffering is suffering. And you can, you know, I'm reminded of a church down in Valencia that has many tourists coming in. You have Catholic church, and you have the confession, and there's not enough priests around for all the languages that come in, so they have this form you fill out, and it's in 5 languages, and you just put a cross next to the sins that you've done on, you know, in the language of your choice, and they solve the problem in that way. Okay. I should mention, Harold Summers developed a simple machine translation device for a medical interview between English and Punjabi. Because let's face it, you know, there's a limited range of common problems that people come in with. And it was really quite easy to establish the glossary and the syntax and the pictures of the body and things so that a Punjabi-speaking patient could have a conversation in very basic terms with an English-speaking doctor. And perhaps technology will eventually solve this problem, among others.
Where is that church in Valencia?
Vanamala from Bangalore, India. Translation is an entirely unorganized sector, unprofessional and unorganized in India. And so I wish we had a Bourdieu who could, talk about this and the kind of exploitation that happens in the, in the industry, where it's not even recognized as a profession, and in a multilingual country like ours, where there is so much need for it, and all other, it's happening through other means, like across courts and so on. And by and large, the only institutions which are recognized as certification bodies are government institutions. And what happens in these government institutions is so inadequate, and court cases pile up for years together for lack of these kinds of facilities. So I wish we had a Bourdieu who could even at least point out these basic problems. And therefore, I was wondering about your last conclusion about Bourdieu and the critique that you made. I was wondering if there's a larger purpose that that kind of a sociological analysis serves, and not so much its problematicity. Can we look at it more positively? That's the question.
Sure. Bourdieu's example in that particular passage is in France, you have Republican education since the revolution, and people believe that there is equality of opportunity through the education system. And yet, any sociological survey shows that if parents are rich, their children do better at school, and this should not happen 200 years later. Okay? It's upsetting to present this information to the ideologies that deny the possibility of that information. And I think the function of the sociologist, and I think in that Bourdieu is quite right, the function is to act as the mouthpiece for social problems that exist. Or his text on the misery of the world, on the homeless in France, comprises, as you know, interviews with homeless people. And he says, my function as a sociologist is to give a voice to these people who don't have a voice. And that is good sociology for me. I'm intrigued by the fact that translators, when they translate, don't have a voice. As I said, they don't have a first person. Translators do hide themselves, do seek that invisibility. One of the ways of giving visibility is to do research. In this case, sociological, but I think all translation studies research can answer that call.
Thank you. Anthony, thanks. I really appreciate. My name is Daud Susilo from Brisbane. I appreciate your presentation and especially your comments on paraprofessionals. And, the fact that like Nati is already overdeveloped. And this is a real case, and I would like you to comment on this situation where in a hospital situation, a visiting parents who do not speak English, but had the emergency, so needing medical care, but because there was no Indonesian translator, they actually called on a Malay translator who is approved by Nati, but it became a disaster because the wife called the pastor of the church. He said, my husband is going to leave this hospital. He will die. That's what the doctor told me. I said, but can't be. Let me come. So then it turns out that Malay and Indonesian are actually two mutually exclusive languages now. And in this emergency situation, so in fact, the pastor have to make a recommendation to the hospital. Next time when you have a case like this, please make sure that you do not get the languages mixed up. So here is a situation where you have a Nati approved translator, but it's the wrong language. And the institution actually pick up the wrong language.
Yeah, I mean, it might be a simple, Bahasa, Malaysia, Bahasa, Indonesia. It might be a simple mistake. I've seen people in Malaysia who read Indonesian literature, but okay, it's not a life or death situation, all right? Though, again, there's a certain pragmatism. Often, I mean, it is bad. If we have a large Moroccan community where I live. They're in hospital. If we can't find an Arabic interpreter, we ask, do you know French? Many do well enough, you know, unless it's intensive care, and you know, according to the high-risk situation, you invest more effort. The problem with Nati for me is that it is a government-owned company. Now, the main employer of interpreters in Australia are the various governments, the federal and the state governments. So you have the employer certifying the workers and fixing the pay rate of the workers in the guise of an association. That's why I said it might be over-organized in a certain way. But the attention to paraprofessional status, which was just pointed out to me, they don't certify paraprofessionals, but they give a description of what they can do, I think is something we do need in Europe very much.
James Maxey, Knight Institute. This isn't a question, it's a point of information and perhaps an option for dialogue. The majority, if not all, the Bible translation personnel that attend NIDA school up to this point are of a level called translation consultant for a variety of organizations. They may have been or may still be translators, but they're this role of consultant. Now, that's prefacing, there is a network organization called the Forum of Bible Agencies International, about 25 member agencies. And I'm looking at a document on my screen that has as a title, Statement on Qualifications for Translation Consultants, Forum of Bible Agencies International. And so it goes on for a couple pages. It has certainly no legal value, this document, and really all the member agencies can ignore it too. So there's really not a lot of weight to it. But several years ago, they tried to get together and say, here would be the qualifications for a translation consultant. I'll just do the headers. Interpersonal skills, they have a paragraph on that. Academic qualifications, translation skills and experience, language and cross-cultural skills, skills in organization and planning, et cetera, et cetera. Professional standards, it goes through a variety of things. Formal recognition of consultants. This has been a way that the Bible agencies have tried to give credentials to these consultants, and so that they, in a sense, can be cross-agency recognized. There's very little mention in this document about translators and their qualifications. Now, each agency has some thought about that, and probably even some documentation. But so once again, no question so much, but as some information that could continue the dialogue, maybe.
Among the possible solutions to a signaling problem is the selection of or authorization of certifying authorities. So instead of bringing in another exam or another set of letters to add to the alphabet soup, you could set up, and this is proposed through TISAC in North America, set up an organism that selects which other bodies are entitled to certify translators and ensure mutual recognition between them. So you might imagine across the globe, you might imagine perhaps 10 to 12 such bodies being recognized and recognizing each other. And that would be a more elegant solution than introducing one fixed set and everybody having to sit a new set of exams and somebody having to decide how to grade the exams on what criteria. Okay, so that's the way the thinking is going at the moment.
We have time, I think, for about 3 more questions, and I have Sona, I have Gilles, and then I have Stefano.
Sona Harutyunyan, University of Venice. You mentioned that men are paid much more for their translation because they claim to use more technology, and so their translation is done more efficiently. So men versus technology and technology versus productivity. As a woman scholar in translation studies and as a practicing translator, I'd like to know your opinion. Why they make this kind of claim, and is there technology which can be considered to have exclusive access only for male translators? Thank you.
Sure, it could be because men are more prone to lie about technology. I mean, it's in the data. We can't do anything else except report what's in the data, but it irritates me.
Thank you. Gil Gravel, Seed Company from Seattle, Washington. Your presentation, it seemed to open up all sorts of cause-effects complexities as I was listening to you. So the question I would like to ask is, with economic globalization comes hyper-innovation, which requires rapid localization. I'm sorry for all the innovation words. So I'm wondering, is the proliferation of these less than authorized translators a cause-effect situation where with hyper-innovation and rapid globalization that the authorized camp, the authorized group of translators cannot keep up with demand? Secondly, these days innovation is rapid and iterative and cheap. That's the current kind of the modus operandi. And because of that, is it possible that organizations are looking for these lower cost, rapid, good enough translations to get their product out there localized and tested to get the feedback that they're looking for? So there's a whole lot of things coming together in this. So I'm wondering how the professionals, the authorized people, can keep up with hyper-innovation and rapid globalization.
A very good question. Yes, the market for translation, the number of pages translated, the number of hours spent on translation in the world increases exponentially. In parallel with the rise of global English, which is an interesting paradox. You would think that if everybody speaks English, we would have fewer translations. It's not the case. Both rise. What's happening is not so much that there are not enough good translators to go around, because the number of translators is increasing as well. The training programs have increased in parallel, less, but have increased over the same period. What's happening is that the demand for rapid translation is being solved by technology, translation memory, machine translation, revised post-edited machine translation. That tends to make a lot of translation work for highly technical texts quite boring. You know, it's really following through and applying the glossary, and don't mess around with that, and don't even try to fix up a mistake if you think it's a mistake. It's becoming quite dehumanizing, and it's becoming work that can be done by language slaves, to use an unkind term, but people who are not highly competent in communicative terms, but can handle the technology and fill in the gaps and apply the glossary fairly well, hence the outsourcing. People with good communicative skills in this industry, and I'm talking about the localization industry, tend to move into the business aspects. You know, talking with the clients and talking with the translators and becoming the project managers.